Who the hell is Mrs. Grundy? We find out, sort of, in this latest episode of Riverdale, so let's dive in on what happened. Lisa back here with another recap of Riverdale, this time for episode 4, The Last Picture Show. This episode revolves around the selling of the local drive-in movie theater, the Twilight Drive-In, where Jughead happens to work. And let's just say it is a very eventful place. Now this episode promised answers as who the mysterious Mrs. Grundy is, but before we dive into that, because it's a lot, let's take a look back at some of the other big reveals in this episode. I'm going to kick things off with Hermione Lodge, Veronica's mom. From what we've seen of her so far, she seems nice and likable, and she's just trying to pick up the pieces of her life and, she's in a tough time with her husband being in jail. She's waitressing at Pop's to make ends meet, and in this episode, I love when she tells Cheryl off.
And lodges are known to have sticky fingers.
Cheryl?
Honey, I got this. Cheryl, I went to school with your mother. She didn't know the difference between having money and having class, either.
While I like Hermione, we all know that everyone is not who they seem in Riverdale, and she is no exception. Outside of Pops, Cheryl happens to see Hermione in the alley behind a dumpster having an intense conversation with a Southside Serpent, aka the biker gang from the south side of town who are made up of a lot of drug dealers and petty thieves, aka not good guys. Cheryl, being her usual annoying self who's got to be in everybody's business, snaps a picture and the next day barges in on Veronica and tells her what she saw and shows her the picture. Veronica then goes and confronts her mom about the picture, and Hermione plays it off saying that she was just catching up with an old friend from high school because she went to school in this town, and so some of the people she used to know might be Southside Serpents. Well, we immediately can tell that Hermione is definitely up to something, but what is she up to exactly? Going back to the drive-in, we know it has been bought by an anonymous buyer, but who is that buyer? It is in fact Lodge Industries, aka Hiram Lodge, or Veronica's dad. Yeah, we see Hermione enter the mayor's office with a bag of money that we saw a few episodes ago given to her by her husband. Hermione hands the bag to the mayor, saying it's a donation for your re-election campaign, which immediately screams, shady deal. It turns out that the Twilight Drive-In is apparently really prime real estate in Riverdale, but we're not quite sure why yet. The mayor tells Hermione that no one can know that she helped boost the deal along, especially the Blossoms, which was interesting because how are the Blossoms going to tie into this, and why would they care about the drive-in and the selling of this land? Hermione assures the mayor that her secret is safe as long as the mayor keeps her end of the bargain. But what is that end of the bargain? The next big reveal comes when Veronica once again confronts her mom about all the shady business. Hermione goes to the last drive-in movie with Fred as a cover, poor Fred, and when she goes to get a refill on the popcorn and powder her nose, well, Veronica sees her go behind the building with the guy from the picture, that Southside Serpent. Sneaks around, listens in on her mom, sees her mom give the guy money, and he says it's not enough money. And back at home, Veronica tells her mom what she saw. Hermione ends up revealing to Veronica that her father hired the Southside Serpents to help decrease the value of the drive-in land so he could purchase it for a cheaper price from an offshore LLC. Hermione was just paying the Serpents for the job well done, and I guess we'll just have to wait and see exactly why everybody wanted this drive-in theater land. Moving on to Jughead, who takes up a few of the reveals on our list. Like I said, he works at the Twilight Drive-In and spends the whole episode being very passionate, telling people that this place is so important, they shouldn't sell it, and he even at one point goes to the mayor to try to convince her. Now, I get that Jughead is a film buff and is very passionate and it's his job, but he gets to the point where it seems so annoying. Like, why is he so invested in this drive-in? Well, we'll learn about that in a second. Since talking to the mayor doesn't work, he goes to Archie's dad, Fred, who has won the bid for the teardown or the destruction of the drive-in. He tries to convince him to kind of stop and not do the teardown, but Fred, reveals that he can't, and Jughead starts to get an attitude, and it brings up his dad. And we learn that Jughead's dad used to work for Fred, but Fred had to let him go because he was stealing materials from the job site, and Jughead seems to be a bit bitter about this still.
You put one Jones out of work. Why don't you put out another, huh?
Jug, your dad was taking materials from one of our job sites. I had to let him go.
Right. Did what you had to do.
Now for the next reveal, remember when I said it seemed like Jughead was like way too passionate and cared too much for this silly little drive-in theater? Turns out the reasoning for this is because not only does he work at the drive-in theater, he actually lives there. Yeah, after playing the last movie, we see Jughead packing up his things into a really big backpack, including a picture, which has another person in it, which makes me wonder, does he have a little sister or sibling we haven't met yet? Or who is that person in the picture with him? But as we pan back, we see a bed in the projector room, and Jughead ends up leaving with all his stuff. And that leads to the next big reveal. Remember that head Southside serpent that Hermione Lodge has been sneaking around with? Turns out that is in fact Jughead's dad.
So where are you gonna live now?
I'll figure it out, Dad. I always do.
When the casting announcement was made that Skeet Ulrich was going to play the gang leader, it said that he had a grudge against Fred Andrews and a mysterious connection to Jughead. Well, now we know the connection to Jughead, father and son, and we're guessing the grudge against Fred is because he fired him. But Jughead's dad ends up asking Jughead where he's going to go live now, and makes me want to learn more about Jughead's backstory and what's going on between him and his dad and why he doesn't live with him. Maybe Jughead didn't want to become a gang member or be associated with the Southside Serpents. Not quite sure, but can't wait for more on that. Now let's move on to what we've been waiting for since we first saw Mrs. Grundy. Who the heck is she? There's so much happening in this part of the storyline with all of this that I'm just going to count it as one big reveal. Betty has indeed put 2 and 2 together and figures out that Archie has something going on with Mrs. Grundy. So we see Fred and Archie at a recital or something where Mrs. Grundy is playing, and Fred ends up asking Mrs. Grundy to go to dinner with them, which of course is like one of the most awkward things possible. But they end up going to Pop's, where of course Betty and Veronica and Kevin and Jughead are hanging out. Betty pulls Archie outside and the two talk, and she reveals that she knows what's going on. So as Archie's kind of revealing a little more detail, Veronica happens to walk out and hears, so pretty much now everyone knows about the affair except for, well, the adults for now. Betty then decides she's going to put her sleuth hat on and Googles Geraldine Grundy. She wants to know who on earth Geraldine is. The next day she also decides to make up this thing for the paper, saying that they're going to start profiling teachers. She interviews Mrs. Grundy, of course, who's going to be the first. And the big reveal here is that before her private independent lessons with Archie, she had done it with 2 other students previously, and one of them happened to be, dun dun dun.
You're working with Archie Andrews on an independent study. Have you ever done this sort of thing before?
Yes, last year, with Tomoko Yoshido and Jason Blossom.
So for all of you that think that, you know, that we're speculating that Grundy and maybe Jason Blossom had an affair, it could be plausible. Betty's kind of thinking this too, I think, that definitely Mrs. Grundy has things for students. So when she asks Mrs. Grundy if she thinks the students are cute, Mrs. Grundy responds,
He was an inspiration. Pretty cute, right? I don't think of my students that way.
yeah, sure, Mrs. Grundy. Betty ends up doing some more digging and tells Archie what she's learned. Basically that Mrs. Grundy showed up a year ago out of nowhere, and before that there's no record of her. All her social media sites and whatnot were made just a year ago, and the only Geraldine Grundy they could find online is an old woman who died 7 years ago. Which is a little funny because in the comics, I think Mrs. Grundy, the teacher, is actually an old lady teacher, but of course, for the CW, they sexed it up a little, made her younger. Betty also tells Archie that Grundy taught Jason, but this all seems to be kind of be going in one ear and out the other for Archie, who's blinded by his hot teacher love affair. And of course he thinks that this is a serious relationship and asks Betty to stop digging around because he's not in any danger and he loves Mrs. Grundy or something, and it's really making me annoyed at Archie. But of course, it's Betty, and Betty can't stop snooping and digging around. Archie has a movie date with Mrs. Grundy, and something that Betty has said to him is still lingering in the back of his head. They always seem to end up talking about him, and he doesn't really know anything about Mrs. Grundy or her backstory. When he asks her to kind of tell him something about her, she tells him that she graduated from Juilliard and had dreams of playing at Carnegie Hall, and she auditioned for all these big symphonies but didn't make it and ended up becoming a teacher. While all this is happening, Betty and Veronica go and break into Grundy's car. Betty finds a toolbox from the back seat, and when she opens it, she finds a Minnesota driver's license with the name Jennifer Gibson on it and dun 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 gun.
That's not the only thing.
Well, Betty may be smart, but she's not smart enough to wear gloves. Don't you know if you're going to break into someone's car or anything, you wear gloves or something to cover up your fingerprints, especially if you're going to touch a possible murder weapon and dangle it around. You don't do that with your bare hands. Come on, Betty. Even Mrs. Lodge was smart enough to wear gloves when handing that bag to the mayor. She should take some notes from Veronica's mom. Betty and Veronica then wait outside Archie's house where they tell him what they found in the car, and Betty says, what if she had something to do with Jason's murder? Oh, Betty, Betty, Betty. We've actually been asking this since, I think, the first episode. Good that you're finally catching on. Later on in the week, Archie and Grundy actually have another date, and this time, Archie's not playing around. Like, that look on his face means he really has some serious business that he wants to take care of. He asks Mrs. Grundy if her real name is actually Jennifer Gibson, and that's when Grundy starts to tell her sub-story. She was once in a bad relationship. She was married to an abusive alcoholic man, and things kind of got out of hand. She ended up in the emergency room a few times, but she ran away, got a divorce, changed her name, and came to Riverdale where she met and fell for Archie. Now, of course, Archie, being the lovesick puppy he is, buys this story, but I'm not quite sure that I am. Did you believe the way she delivered that? Alright, so the next big moment comes when that evil Alice Cooper is putting away Betty's laundry, and she discovers the gun in Betty's drawer. Gotta say, there's another set of fingerprints on a possible murder weapon. Don't these people watch crime shows? She could easily pick that up with a shirt or something. Alice, being the Alice that she is, of course, flips out. She ends up reading Betty's diary, finds out everything. She confronts Betty, makes her get in the car, and where do they end up? Well, at the school with Fred Andrews, where they walk in on Archie and Mrs. Grundy. Because you see, instead of going to the drive-in, Archie opted to go see Mrs. Grundy, who's randomly at school, really late at night. They're about to kind of get really close and kiss when these three barge in and Alice says,
"There they are. What did I tell you?"
Can someone tell me what's going on here?
Of course. Archie, would you like to share with us what you and Mrs. Robinson have been doing during your music lesson? And
Alice is definitely not holding back, and Archie just seems to, like, not want Mrs. Grundy still to get in trouble, so he's trying to take the blame for everything that happened and saying that she's not a child predator and he wanted this all to happen. And of course, Alice is out to get Archie, and she says she's not even after Mrs. Grundy, she's after Archie, and she wants Betty to see the kind of person that he is, which is pretty harsh, right? She's definitely still trying to stop Archie and Betty from being friends, and even earlier in the episode, she showed up on Fred's doorstep to kind of make this point clear. Archie decides that he's going to give Alice what she wants, and he says this.
You're right, Miss Cooper. You're right. I'm selfish, and I'm stupid, and I don't deserve to be your daughter's friend. But please, don't hurt Miss Grundy because you want to hurt me.
Alice isn't stopping there. She's threatening to tell everyone and make Grundy out to be a child predator when Betty butts in and she threatens to say that she broke into Grundy's car, that she robbed her, and that she made up the story of the fair, and
It will be like I finally snapped. Like Polly.
It will prove what everyone already thinks about us. Crazy runs in that family.
Like mother, like daughter.
well then, this is interesting. Does this mean that at some point Alice snapped and had a crazy moment too? Mrs. Grundy ends up saying she's gonna quit, and they tell her she has to leave town by the morning, which of course is gonna break Archie's little heart. Later, back at the Cooper house, we finally see a less annoying side of Alice Cooper. It's like the first time. Alice is telling Betty that Polly kept so many secrets that she doesn't want secrets between her and Betty. Betty then says to Alice,
What's my name, Mom? Say it. Elizabeth Cooper? That's right.
I am Elizabeth. I am not Polly. Archie is not Jason, so stop using them as an excuse to control my life.
you go, Betty. I love finally seeing Betty stand up to Alice. And also, Alice didn't even have a snarky comeback for this at all. Instead, she just got up and silently left the room. So it seems like Mrs. Grundy is going to be gone and maybe going to stop ruining things in Riverdale. Or actually, will she? When she's leaving town, we kind of see that she hasn't changed at all.
Things too. Maybe Miss Grundy was dangerous in some way.
Guess some things never change and she's still going to have it out for younger guys, high school boys. Will she actually come back? That's what I want to know. Maybe she still has something to do with the murder. She definitely has a connection to Jason Blossom, which I hope that we learn more about. What was he up to with Mrs. Grundy? Now, the last big reveal in this episode comes thanks to the hilarious Kevin Keller. I love that we finally get to see more of him in this episode, and he's starting to get a little bit of a storyline. Now, he does get some loving in this episode thanks to a Southside Serpent, but that's not the big thing that happens. Earlier in the episode, we see Kevin, going to get the car keys from his dad, and we see the murder wall at his house kind of outlining everything that they know about Jason's murder. Which is interesting because shouldn't that be at the sheriff's office or something, maybe not in your own home? So when they return home from the drive-in movie, they see that the house has been broken into, Files and papers are spread out all over the floor, and the murder board has been, like, destroyed. So someone knows that maybe Sheriff Keller is moving in pretty closely, and they don't want Jason's murder to be solved. But who is it? Whew, okay, so that was a lot. And it is now time to start theorizing again. Do you all still think Mrs. Grundy had something to do with Jason's murder? What are the Lodges going to do with that drive-in land? And where is Jughead going to live now? And who broke into Sheriff Keller's house? So many things. Also, a lot of you in the comments, you're always saying that you think Betty and Polly could in fact be the same person. Maybe Betty has some kind of dissociative, like, disorder or split personalities or something. And I can kind of see where you're coming from with that. But I still think Polly is a different person. Like, Polly is her sister. And that Polly is off somewhere, you know, recovering, and hopefully we'll get to meet her soon. I just feel like there may be some clues that kind of possibly hint at that. And I thought that the choices of the movies that the group suggested for the last drive-in were interesting and could have pointed to that, like The Talented Mr. Ripley. But then I rethought that and was like, maybe that's actually a reference to Mrs. Grundy and her stolen identity and not Betty and Polly. I'm not sure. But also, I feel like it would just be too hard for Betty and Polly to be the same person. They would have been at school at the same time, right? Aren't they only like a year or so apart? Jason is Cheryl's twin, right? And Cheryl, so they all would have gone to school together, and I don't know. It's just all confusing, and I don't think Betty and Polly could have been the same person. But that's not saying that there's not definitely some mental things going on with that whole family. Now, the promo for next week's episode looks super exciting, and maybe some bigger secrets will be revealed.
Every town has one.
Thank you all for coming.
The spooky house that all the kids avoid.
I'd like to start the memorial. Remember, she is burying her brother.
You're so much like him.
Stay out of it.
Oh my god. Tell me what's going on!
Ready to enter the belly of the beast?
So it looks like there's going to be a memorial for Jason, and we'll finally address the fact that Archie and Jason look a lot alike thanks to creepy Mrs. Blossom. Like, we're finally get to see more of her, I guess, and it seems like someone has it out for Hermione Lodge. I know I can't wait for next week, but now I want to know all your theories and thoughts, as always, on the episode in the comments below, or you can hit me up on social media. Which moment shocked you the most? Have your thoughts about who the killer are changed at all? Then you can go and check out some more of this week's recaps right over here. And don't forget to subscribe. Then come back next week so we can try and figure out this murder of Jason Blossom together, because I am hooked on Riverdale. Lisa here, signing out for this episode of What Happened. See ya.